I always told my students that the greatest skill of a rabbi is not speaking. The greatest skill of a rabbi is listening. Can you listen to people? Can you hear what they're concerned about? Can you hear what they're saying to you? Can you hear what they're not saying to you? When you go to a funeral where there's a catastrophe, people don't often come right up to you and say, "Why did God let this happen?" But they're all thinking it. And they all want to know, where is your theology? You have all these books in your office, Rabbi. Doesn't one of them have an answer to this question? Right? You give all these sermons. Can't you help me find a pathway from brokenness back to wholeness? That you have to listen for the questions they're not asking. And you have to speak to those questions and be bold and strong and speak to those questions.
In this heartfelt episode of the Maggid Method, we journey through the life of an inspiring storyteller and educator, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, Rabbi Emeritus of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California, beginning with his parents' Zionist socialist roots.
My story begins with my parents, who were children of immigrants and were members of Eretz, Zionist, socialist, anti-religious kibbutz movement.
To his impactful career in Jewish education.
My first ambition was to become a teacher or an educator. Standing on a bima in a robe, telling people how to live their lives. Ugh, not for me. I loved kids.
Our guest shares how his upbringing and his camp experiences shaped his passion for storytelling and teaching.
I went to Ramah as a young teenager, as a junior counselor. So, Shabbos afternoon, all the kids would gather on the lawn with popsicles, and I was the storyteller. And I discovered the power of telling a story.
We also talk about Rabbi Feinstein's influential mentors.
When I was 16 years old, Harold Schulweis, this amazing orator and rabbi, came to the community. And I remember I went to go hear him and just was blown away by his capacity to convey huge ideas in ways that were so compelling and so engaging.
We discovered the profound lessons he learned at the family Shabbos table.
But Friday nights were sacred in our home. We'd have a dinner and we would have a conversation. My father would, as it were, hold court. He would ask a question. And for the next several hours, we discussed big ideas.
And we talk about the importance of conveying deep truths through sermons.
They've been sold their whole lives. They've been exposed to commercials, ads, social media, influencers, all of this selling their whole lives. And when they come to shul, they don't want to be sold something. They want someone to authentically share a truth that matters.
This episode is a treasure trove of wisdom, humor, and authenticity that will resonate with anyone interested in the art of meaningful communication. So now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rabbi Ed Feinstein.
There we go. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Nice to meet you.
Sorry I'm late.
No problem. Anywhere you want to start from is great.
All right. Stop me if this goes too long. My story begins with my parents, who were children of immigrants and were members of Eretz, Zionist, socialist, anti-religious kibbutz movement. In 1947, the word went out, and my father hitchhiked from L.A. to New Jersey. My mother lived in Newark. She came down to a hakshara, a farm in Hightstown, New Jersey, chicken farm, where they were preparing young Americans to make Aliyah to Israel. That's where they met. That's where they married. They went to Israel. They founded a kibbutz in Israel, and would have made a life in Israel. But the movement, Eretz, had a political crisis, and my parents were on the wrong side of the crisis for the groups they were in, and they were basically thrown off the kibbutz, along with half of the garin. They stayed another half a year in Israel and decided it was time to come home and begin a family. So they came back to America, and the joke in our family was that I was conceived on the boat on the way home. It was my father's gift to my mother. Come home, I'll give you a baby.
Uh-huh.
And so my parents were not religious, but they were very serious Jews. And as I grew up, we moved to California when I was 6. When I grew up, my mom and dad owned a bakery Dad's a baker. He learned to be a baker for the kibbutz. And mom, because she was the maskira of the kibbutz, sat in the front, ran the front of the shop. But Friday nights were sacred in our home. Dad came home early. Mom came home. She cooked a giant meal. She was a kibbutz cook after all. And we sat down to dinner at 6:30 on Friday night. We'd have a dinner and we would have a conversation. My father would, as it were, hold court. He would ask a question. And for the next several hours, we discussed big ideas. We discussed civil rights for African Americans. We discussed Israel and its existence. We discussed feminism. We discussed all of that. The Vietnam War was being fought at the time, and I received a kind letter from the president asking me to participate. So the question was, does a Jew who enjoys the liberties of America have an obligation to support all of its projects, even if we think this one is wrong? And all of these great issues and all the Jewish issues about God and Torah and evil and good. And it was so good at that table that my high school friends used to come over and sit with us. Not that, first of all, because they had a four-course dessert, but because families didn't have this kind of conversation. And this was cherished. So my first exposure to Jewish life in that sense was at that table where ideas mattered. And your ability to express an idea, to question ideas, to argue for a point of view was very, very important at that table. And that stuck with me my whole life. I'm a person who, I have always books behind me because I just love ideas. I live in the world of ideas, and I love I love teaching ideas to folks. The second influence was camp. I went to Ramah as a young teenager, as a junior counselor. I started in day camps, and then when I was a kid, and then I moved up to Ramah and spent summers, many summers in Ramah as a counselor and a Rosh Hashanah, and then as a teacher, and then eventually I was the director of the camp.
Yeah, I read that.
And yeah, and in Ramah, there too, I discovered the capacity for storytelling. So, Shabbos afternoon, all the kids would gather on the lawn with popsicles, and I was the storyteller. And I would tell dozens of stories every Shabbos, to every group in the camp. And I discovered the power of telling a story and how stories capture the imagination, speak to the heart, and how those big ideas that my dad advocated for could be conveyed through stories and in so much better than just discursive conversation. Those are really the two influences. And then I had, when I was 16 years old, Harold Schulweis, this amazing orator and rabbi, came to the community. And I remember I went to go hear him and just was blown away by his capacity to convey huge ideas in ways that were so compelling and so engaging. And to speak, I mean, Harold used to speak above the audience's head. I mean, the joke was that when you joined our synagogue, you got a philosophical dictionary. Because if you didn't know what the word teleological meant, or metaphysical meant, or axiological, you wouldn't understand what he was talking about. But that was on purpose, because he wanted to show this congregation that religious life is not intellectually weak, that religious life is not for the intellectually lazy, but that religious life is really the cutting edge of intellectual sophistication. And so he spoke in a vocabulary and in an idiom and in a manner which told you that this was a person of superior vision, intelligence, and moral imagination. And that's what Judaism was for Harold. So these are the influences that moved me. I went to JTS. My first ambition was to become a teacher, or an educator. I was of the generation that questioned all authority. So I had no truck with being a rabbi, standing on a bima in a robe, telling people how to live their lives. Ugh, not for me. I loved kids. So I went to JTS and right across the street was Columbia University's Teachers College. I actually audited a class from my living room window one springtime because I could hear the lecture from across the street. So I went downstairs, enrolled in the program, started taking classes, finished with a master's degree and most of a doctorate from Columbia. And I decided rather than write the doctorate, those are the days when day schools were were spreading around the country among non-Orthodox communities. Day schools had been in the Orthodox world for a generation. And I wanted to write and study day school education, day school curriculum, but I decided I ought to know something about it before I talk about it. So I took a job in Dallas, Texas, as the first director of a small Jewish day school there that was attached to a conservative synagogue. And I had a dual job. I was the day school director Monday through Friday, and I was the rabbi of the synagogue, assistant rabbi of the synagogue on Shabbos and Sundays. So I had a chance to talk to kids all week and talk to grown-ups on the weekend. And I discovered, I love being a teacher, and I love teaching, and I love telling stories to kids. But then I had to write sermons, right? And I know how to write. I took a class. Simon Greenberg of blessed memory was my professor at seminary and taught me how to write sermons. He was an amazing, amazing scholar and orator and teacher. And I would try to write in the way that Professor Greenberg taught me. But the problem was that, especially as we started having our family, by Friday afternoon, I was beat. So I remember one particular Friday, I'm supposed to give a sermon on a Friday night, and I was exhausted. It was a tough week, and it was long, and the kids were sick, and I didn't get a chance to write a sermon. I had told stories all morning. So I said, what the heck? I went Friday night, had a crowd of people in the shul, and I told the grown-ups the same story I had told the day school kids that morning. I just upped the words a little bit. And at the climax of the sermon, I stopped and I said, let's talk about what this story means. And I sort of gave the moral of the story. You know something? That's the one sermon people remembered. People called me all week going, what a sermon. And they told me, their kids called me and said, my parents told me the story you told Shabbos. And I discovered that grown-ups are little kids when it comes to this kind of moral truth, and that you just have to tell stories in a different way. And that's the secret that I learned to homiletics, to sermon giving, is engage people in a narrative that makes them feel part of a process of the discovery of moral truth, of Torah. If they feel like they're receiving Torah through a story, then it'll stay with them, and it really does change lives.
So tell me a little bit about the storytelling you did when you started in camp. Was that just self-taught? Did you mimic anybody? Were you?
Well, no, I had friends who I watched people tell stories, but I just sort of did it myself. And at first it was a story I found here and a story I found there. And then pretty soon I realized that, number one, I'm good at this. And number two, it works. So I started doing a ton of reading, looking for stories. And over the years collected a pretty good catalog of Jewish stories. At one point, my friend David Berman is the great publisher of Berman House Books, and I sold him on the idea of publishing a collection of my stories. And so there's a book out called Capturing the Moon. It's with Berman House, and it's my stories, but I put at the end the stuff I use for sermons. So at the end of it's every rabbi's dream. This is instant sermons, rabbis. At the end of each story is a text and 3 study questions and the moral of the story. This is instant sermon. The reason I wrote that book, though, is actually a little more poignant than that. I'm a cancer survivor. I had colon cancer, and then I had it twice. The second time, it was very, very dangerous. And they really told me there's a very good chance you're not going to survive this. And I had been telling my own children these stories, bedtime stories and other Shabbos stories. And I didn't want to leave the world without leaving my kids the collection of my stories. So I wrote 36 stories into this book. And I told David Berman that I'd written this thing. And he said, send it to me. And he wrote me back right away and said, we got to publish this. This is too good. And that's how that book got published. It was really a gift to my own kids to make sure that if I wasn't around, they would own my stories. And since then, it's been, it's a gift. It's a beautiful gift. We give it to our Hebrew school kids, and there's lots of schools around the country that use it as a sort of storybook for kids.
Well, I'm going to go get a copy, and I'll send it to you to sign, and then you'll.
I'd be delighted, or I'll come to Columbus and sign it for you.
Yeah. So where did you go to look for your stories?
Everywhere. I mean, I have lots of books of Jewish folklore. See, the interesting thing is you got to find a story that says something. And that ultimately, Daniel, if I call you Daniel, that ultimately is the thing that rabbis need to hear. it's great to have technique, and you should have technique, and it's great to have personality, and it's great to be able to make people laugh and people cry. All of that's important, but it's not the most important. Those are instruments, those are techniques. The most important truth about giving a sermon, about a drasha, is that you have something to say, that you have a truth. You have a piece of Torah that you so love that you want to share it with the Jewish people. You want to share it with the community. That's the thing, if I can be really perfectly frank and a little critical, the thing that frustrates me to no end when I hear sermons from colleagues is that they have all kinds of talent in terms of making people laugh, making people cry, telling stories, but they forgot a truth. They forgot to tell us something. And then it devolves into entertainment. I live in LA. It's the world of entertainment, right? But the truth is, you're never going to get people to laugh as much as Jerry Seinfeld, and you're never going to get people cry as much as Laurence Olivier, right? That's not what we're here to do. You're here to teach Torah. We have a truth. We Jews have inherited this incredible truth. Not incredible, it's credible. This marvelous truth. And it's our job as rabbis and teachers to convey that truth in certain pieces to the people we love. And if there isn't a truth burning in you so bright that you just have this compulsion to share it with, don't give a talk. Go let somebody else give it. Right? One of the great preachers of the 20th century was Stephen S. Wise. And he once gave a graduation speech at HUC. And it was during the days when synagogues were building swimming pools and gymnasiums and bowling alleys. It was called the Synagogue Center, right? And Wise says to these young rabbis, he says, gentlemen, you don't need a bowling alley or a gymnastics class or a cooking class or a knitting group to move Jews. You need Torah. You need a fire in you. You need a message. And if you don't have a message, then go into another profession. So the most important thing is not just the stories, it's not just the techniques. Do you have a thesis, a message, a Torah that you need to convey to these people? And right now, given the world and all of its pain and all of its difficulty, there's so much Torah that we need to give to people. But that's the thing that's the failure that I note most when I listen to sermons and I watch sermons. I read a lot of sermons. I want to see what other people are talking about. I want to see the ideas, the sources people are quoting. I also want to see the stories they're telling. But most of all, I want to see what's the truth that this person is so is so convinced. This person is so passionate about that he or she wanted to get in front of me and offer me a sermon. That's the most important thing.
So you see that the stories are a vehicle.
Absolutely. The stories are a vehicle. Humor is a vehicle. Personal experiences are a vehicle. Book reviews are a vehicle. Anything you want to bring is a vehicle, but there has to be a truth. The other piece of this that I'll throw in, because I'm sure you'll ask me about this soon. I grew up at the end of a sort of generation of great rabbis. Schulweis was one of the very end of them. These were guys of all kinds. There were great ones and not so great ones, and they really knew technique. And I remember listening to some great preachers, just great preachers. But my generation rebelled against that. They rebelled because my generation didn't want authorities standing in front of us, preaching at us. My generation wanted something they called authenticity. Authenticity is you and me talking is authentic. You telling me, here's my experience, here's what I learned from it, is authentic. Authenticity involves a certain quality of vulnerability. I'm going to let you into my soul and things that hurt me. Authenticity. And I've discovered in my career that not only did my generation demand that, the next generations demanded even more so. I think it's because these are generations raised on commercial television and now social media. They've been sold their whole lives. They've been exposed to commercials, ads, social media, influencers, all of this selling their whole lives. And when they come to shul, they don't want to be sold something. They want to be They want someone to authentically share a truth that matters. And if you can say, look, this really, I say to my people, give you an example. I talk about Shabbos an awful lot. First of all, because as I said, the Shabbat table was the place where I found my soul, found my voice, really. And I say to people, like, you got to make Shabbos. If you could live a week and not sit down with your family, light candles, have kiddush and a challah, and talk about life, tell stories, share experiences. If your kids don't know that once a week we as a family are going to have dinner together, and it's kodesh, it's holy, it's sacred, it'll not be interrupted. If your kids don't know that, you have lost the most precious thing God gave the Jewish people, right? And it's not like, I don't keep Shabbos because God told me to keep Shabbos. I keep Shabbos because I'd be insane if I didn't. It's not that God, because I come from this crazy anti-religious family. My father would teach us that it's not that God gave us Shabbos, is that God comes and sits at the table with us. We meet God at the Shabbos table because we meet the people we love the most. Now, you talk in that way to people, which is so much more authentic than here is the meaning of the Sabbath, you know? They listen. They listen. So it begins with a truth that's burning inside of you, and then it gets expressed in an idiom which is authentic and personal. And then if you want to attach a story, you want to tell a joke, you want to quote an article in the New York Times, fine. But it's got to be authentic and it's got to be your truth.
It's got to have substance, not all the flash and the.
You can have flash. Flash is lovely, but if there's all flash and no substance, there's no truth there. And if it's too much, you're showing. The other thing that rabbis sometimes do is show off how much I know. Right? You and I can read a page of Gemara. So if you start quoting, it says in the Gemara Brachos on pages, come on. Teach them something. Tell them what the Gemara Brachos is and why you read it and why it's important and what it's. You got to open this stuff up. Stop standing above them. Stand with me. Look at me eye to eye. Look at me eye to eye.
So what was the style that you learned in JTS with Simon Greenberg, Professor Greenberg? What was the
Professor Greenberg was one of the great preachers of that generation, of that great generation. The funny thing was, I remember him as being 7'9", this giant of sandy hair, like this. He looked like a Protestant preacher, chiseled jaw, black suit, white shirt, black tie, shiny black shoes. Would call to me from the back of the room going, Mr. Feinstein, do you have a thesis? I went back to JTS some years after I graduated for a meeting, and I saw him in the hallway. He was 5'8". I couldn't believe it. He scared the hell out of me. I mean, when you get to heaven, if God looks anything like Simon Greenberg, it'll just make perfect sense. But he was so loving. He so loved Torah, and he so loved us, his students. And he so cherished the idea that we were going to take his Torah, his technique. His basic idea was, number one, your sermon has to have a thesis. A thesis could be stated in one literate English sentence. Here's what he would say. He'd say, what's the truth of a sermon? The truth of a sermon is not that you got an audience to laugh or cry. The truth of a sermon isn't even in the room. The truth of the sermon is when they all go home, Rosh Hashanah afternoon, and they all sit around big family tables, Rosh Hashanah afternoon for lunch, and they all went to 5 or 6 different synagogues, and they say, what did your rabbi say? Can your congregant repeat back in one literate English sentence what you said? And what you said has to be, number one, it has to be provable. And number two, it can't be trivial. Trivial means it's something everybody, pshita, everybody already knows that. If you say Hamas is evil, that's pshita, right? If you say Israel has to make some accommodation with the Palestinians, otherwise it's survival, that's an interesting thesis. I'm not sure it's provable, but it's an interesting thesis, right? So it has to be a thesis. It has to be provable, but not trivial. Simon Greenberg taught us that's the most important thing. And the text that he was drawn to was Pirkei Avot. He made us memorize Pirkei Avot because he said you'll find in this a wisdom and you'll keep coming back to it because its wisdom is so deep. But it's what's interesting about Pirkei Avot is that you first read it and it's because it's aphoristic. It's like, sure, of course. It's only when you read it the third time that you stop and say, "Oh, wait a minute. What does that mean? Why is it stated that way?" And he was right, by the way. I've gone back to Pirkei Avot so many times. I mean, one of the beautiful things, it's printed in the Siddur. So when I get bored in shul, there's a Mishnah there to learn. It's Machaya, But you find something. So this was Greenberg's great truth.
Yeah. I'm curious, what are the parameters of homiletics, of drush, in the conservative movement? Are there any rules as to, what
No,
you,
no. And you'll see the variety. You'll see a variety of styles. It really is very idiosyncratic to different rabbis. The classic style, which I teach homiletics at the AJU at Ziegler, the Ziegler Rabbinical School. So we start out with what I think is the skill, the underneath foundational skill, which is the preparation, delivery, and then critique of a 20-minute sermon. If you can give a 20-minute sermon, and a 20-minute sermon is approximately 2,000 words. And the reason I picked a 20-minute sermon is because, see, in a 10-minute Devar Torah, you can sort of fake it. But by 20 minutes, you better have something to say. In 20 minutes, there really has to be something to say. So it forces students to like think again. What I always tend is I always show them, go back and think again. Go back over the text, look at it again, find another layer of depth. One of my favorite writers, believe it or not, is I think he's an Episcopal minister in Seattle named Robert Fulghum. He became famous many years ago because he published a little essay called "Everything I Need to Know in Life I Learned in Kindergarten." And then, so I bought his books, and his books are really what they are his columns. He writes a newsletter for his church. And what Fulghum is so good at doing is looking at ordinary things and seeing enormous depth, enormous human truth in ordinary things. He has an essay on racism based on a box of Crayola crayons. He says 64 colors of Crayola crayons can get along in the box. How come we can't? And it's but if you read the essay, it's like, wow. He had an essay that I actually read every couple of years. I read this as an introduction, a kavanah for Kol Nidre. It's about hide and seek. It's about hide and seek. And it's about kids playing hide and seek in his neighborhood. And about the kid who hid so well that nobody could find him. And how grown-ups do that. How we hide, right? And you talk about all the hiding in the Torah, for example. Adam and Eve hiding in the garden, right? And just it's such a so he has this way of finding the depth, and that's what I try to get my students to do. If you can do a 20-minute sermon, then you can riff off of that. You can go longer, you can go shorter, but you'll learn how to talk to that depth of people. That to me is the most important thing. You got to, and the way I do it when I prepare a sermon is I look for an idea that surprises me. If I find an idea and I go, "Oh, I didn't think of that," or that's new to me, that's a depth of something, then I know if it surprises me, it might just surprise my congregation. If it doesn't surprise me, I know that already. Then it's out. It's trivial already. But I want something that surprises me, moves me, right? I gave a sermon, not this last year, the year before, and I the text I used, believe it or not, was Shema Yisrael. It's the most pshita text, right? I like to take ordinary texts, and the idea that surprised me was that Shema Yisrael is a mitzvah. It's not. We always jump to the next phrase, Adoshem Elokeinu, right? And Adonai Echad. That's monotheism, right? That's where we. But I said, no, stop! Don't go so fast. Why is Shema a mitzvah? First of all, why is it Shema and not Daber? Why isn't it go and tell the world that there is one God? Why is it Shema? And what does it mean Shema? And how do I learn to listen? I'm a guy. I'm not good at listening, right? My wife had to teach me how to listen. And where are the places in my life where I failed to listen? I mean, that was what the sermon was about. And how much of our social dilemma right now is because people are screaming because they feel like nobody's listening to them. Now, Shita, I mean, that's that kind of an idea. Find something that surprises you. Because when I found that, I said, I never thought of it that way. It just never occurred to me that way. And then the sermon rolled out. It just really rolled out. I look for an idea that surprises me. But in the conservative movement, you'll find everything. You'll find very flamboyant. You'll find very subdued. You'll find very intellectual. You'll find very sort of folksy. You'll find very touchy-feely. You'll find long, short. You'll find everything. You find everything. It really is idiosyncratic to the particular rabbi and to the congregation that engages them.
Yeah. So you teach homiletics, and I guess the North Star is find a truth and then build around that. Is that
Find a thesis, yeah.
thesis?
Sometimes it goes the other way around. Sometimes I start writing a sermon and I don't discover the thesis till I'm 3/4 of the way done, right? You know, sometimes I'm actually giving a sermon and I'm in the middle of giving it and I realize, wait a minute, there's a bigger truth here that I just either I just said or I just found. I mean, so sometimes I have to go back and rewrite it. In the old days, it was hard to do because I'd written things out longhand. Now I can do things on the computer. It's much easier to rewrite stuff. But it takes a while to find a truth that sits with me that makes me say, yes, that's what I want them to hear this year. That's what's important.
And I would imagine that it's more message based necessarily than text based. Meaning you, like you said, you decide what they need to hear, and then you find the Torah to support that.
It goes back and forth. All Jewish sermons argue one fundamental thesis. Your life, the meaning and purpose and joy of your life is found in Torah. That's the meta thesis of all Jewish preaching. If your Jewish preaching isn't rooted based on and expressive of Torah and doesn't teach a Jew that they're going to find a better life in living a life of Torah, then you're go to another job. Right? I mean, because anybody can read the New York Times or the New Yorker. The reason you come to listen to me is because I spent a bunch of years marinating in Torah. I have my young students always ask me, why should they listen to me? I'm so much younger. I don't have their life experience. I'm standing in front of professors and lawyers and writers. And I said, simple. They want to hear Torah. They don't want to hear you. They want to hear Torah. They want to hear your Torah, though. They want to hear Torah filtered through your sensibilities. So sometimes it starts with Torah, and sometimes it starts with a message, and then I find the Torah. You know, by this point in my life, like you, I've been living in Torah so long that it all gets mushmashed. It's immediately I say, oh, that's like that, you know, right? But sometimes when I learn every day like everybody, you know, and I'll come across something, I say, oh, that's I got to teach that. That's something I got to teach. That's a line that deserves to be shared. That's an idea that deserves to be shared. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, the congregations that I've worked with are different than the ones that you participate in because they're far less literate. So if I want to preach something that I learned in a Gemara, I have to first tell them what a Gemara is. All right. And you do that in a respectful way. It's not that they're dumb. God forbid. I got so many smart people here. But they're not as well read as people in an Orthodox community because they don't have the background. So you introduce it, you allow them to know it, you help them get there. So one of the things I teach my students is if you're going to quote an authority, just give us one line about who they are. Don't just say Rashi. Just say Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, 11th century French writer, who made a wonderful Merlot, you know, and wrote the most amazing commentaries on scripture and on Gemara, on Talmud. And he says, you know, now that tells my people, gives them a historical background. Then people will come to me after and say, tell me, how can I learn this guy? That's a great triumph. That's the thing. But it all gets mixed up. It doesn't start message to text to message. It all comes from the same sort of moral mishmash, the same kind of, because you're always learning. You have to always be learning to be a rabbi. You can't ever stop. That's one of the things Simon Greenberg taught us. He said, gentlemen, in those days it was all men, gentlemen, you're never going to read a book again the same way. You're going to always read a book with a pencil in your hand. and a card where you can write down. You're always going to be looking, and you always have to be learning. You can never stop learning.
So talk to me about 20 minutes, because that in today's day and age, that sounds almost like a movie, like a,
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. You ever watch a movie and you realize that the writers ran out of ideas about 20 minutes, 30 minutes ago? Like this was a great 30-minute television show, but not a 2-hour movie, right? That's exactly the point. The 20 minutes means you have to really think on a level of depth, a real level of depth, and that demands some work, some real intellectual and imaginative work, and not to pad it with a bunch of stuff, which is what rabbis often do. But teach me the idea, get me an idea that's deep, that speaks to me, that speaks to my moment. The other quality, I'll throw this in. I think I've spoken about 3 or 4 qualities about this now. Preaching takes a quality of courage. You're teaching people a truth, and often it's a truth they don't want to hear, right? If all we had to do is give sweet light, sweet and light, then this would be a much easier job. But sometimes we have to teach controversial truths. Sometimes we have to teach truths that disturb people. Sometimes we have to shake people up. And that's not easy. That's not easy because all of us want to be beloved and we want to keep our jobs, you know. So don't be obnoxious. I mean, don't be crazy and obnoxious. But on the other hand, it takes a kind of courage. Harold Schulweis, my teacher, the most courageous man I ever met, because he was a man deeply rooted in Torah. And yet he knew that for Torah to be alive in this moment, it had to find idioms, it had to find ways of expression that had never been found before. And that was new. These were new ways of expression. And he had to, and Harold was fearless about talking about the most difficult kinds of issues. I mean, one of the issues that really motivated him from very early in his rabbinate, it was the issue that motivated his rabbinate, was the question of evil, of why bad things happen to good people. He was 17 years old when the Holocaust, he was born in 1925. So he was 17 years old when the Holocaust took place and, began. And he knew this was so important to him. And then at the same time, he becomes a congregational rabbi. And in the first week, the child of a prominent member of the synagogue died. And he had to do a burial of a child, which any congregational rabbi will tell you is the hardest thing we do. It is just tears your soul to bits. And here he's standing at the grave with a tiny little casket, trying to say something about God and God's justice and God's love. And it just shook him to the core. So that was something he spoke about frequently. It's an issue that most rabbis shy away from because it's scary. It's an issue that we don't have a simple answer for, right? But he was so courageous in saying, you've got to tell, because that's why people come to religion. They come to religion to help us, to ask us to put their lives back together after their lives have been shattered by events of evil, of pain, of suffering, of destruction. And we have to give them an idea, a pathway back to wholeness. And we have to talk about God. You can't avoid it, and I grew up in a generation when we never talked about God. I remember going to my rabbi. My rabbi was the rabbi I grew up with, a wonderful, wonderful rabbi, brilliant, wise, loving, kind. And I remember how when I was a pain in the ass teenager, and I said to him, how come we never talk about God around here? And he was so kind. And he sort of put his head down. I could see tears in his eyes. And he said, it's impossible. He said, I have survivors sitting in front of me. Had a lot of survivors in the show. He said, what am I going to say about God to people that saw Auschwitz? What am I going to say to people, to talk about God? How can I talk about God? So we talked about everything else, talked about the Jewish people and Israel and family life. And Harold that didn't impede Harold. Harold said, we've got to talk about God. We've got to talk about evil. We've got to talk about the deep questions of theology. We can't shy away from them because we have to be honest with these people. And those are the questions they're asking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a sermon what I did was I went to the YouTube channel for VBS and I clicked most popular. And the video that came up was your sermon. It was during the I guess it was during the Trump election.
Oh,
Like
that's the most popular one on YouTube?
that's the one that got the most views.
Oh
Yeah.
my
It was
God,
Rosh
really?
Hashanah sermon. And so what I like to do is I like to read through the comments because I try to get a feel for how people react to it.
No,
And,
they
you
hated
know,
it.
yeah, well, some did, some didn't. But one of the overarching themes that people were arguing with each other back and forth in the comments were about, is that the role of a rabbi on Rosh Hashanah during his sermon slot to be discussing politics like that, and that it seemed to be from their perspective, it seemed to be devoid of any Torah. It sounded like it was like a political tirade. I'm just
It
curious.
wasn't a tirade, it was a speech.
Yeah,
It wasn't a tirade.
yeah.
All right, so this is what happened. Um, Trump got elected, and I really I was worried. And I didn't say anything when Trump got elected. And I didn't say anything the first year, and I didn't say anything the second year. By 2000, I think it was 2018, right?
2018, yeah.
Um, I could see what this man was doing to this country. And I asked myself, you have a pulpit, you have the biggest pulpit in the community. You have nothing to say about this? People kept saying to me, "Don't you have anything to say about this?" And I kept being worried that one day my grandchildren would come to me and say, "Abba, you had the biggest pulpit in the community and you didn't say anything about this? Why didn't you say anything about this?" So I tried to say in the most articulate way in a framework. And I made two decisions, well, three. One, that I would give a sermon about this because I felt at that time, and I don't want to anger any of your listeners, but I feel today again that this man and what he stands for is profoundly destructive of American democracy. Now, understand, I'm not a liberal. I'm a centrist. Politically, I voted for Republicans and I voted for Democrats. I'm a political centrist. Very rare that people like me, but I'm a political centrist, both on Israel and on America. I'm not that liberal left wing out there rabbi who was always preaching that stuff. I never preach politics, almost never preach politics. Um, but as a centrist, I also have a profound love of American democracy because, like you probably, I have my grandparents came from Europe. They came running away from terror and pogrom, and they found here a home. And American liberalism, not liberal politics, but liberalism, the welcoming of all groups, the opportunities and safety and security that American democracy has offered Jews, to me is sacred. I'm a patriot. I mean, I put my hand over my heart when I sing the national anthem because I believe in this country and I believe that that it's given Jews an opportunity that unimaginable in our history, unimaginable in our history. So the question is, if this guy is going to destroy American democracy, does a rabbi have an obligation to say something? And when? And I decided you do it. If you're going to do it, you do it. You go big. You go big or go home. So I did it on Rosh Hashanah. So the first question was, do you give the sermon? And I said I would. The second question was, what do you say? And I found a book by a wonderful author, the historian John Meacham, called The Soul of America, which was his response to Trump. And he talks about American politics being pulled between two poles, fear and hope. And he said, when we are pulled toward hope, we are at our best. And when we are pulled toward fear, we are at our worst. And it was such a compelling thesis. And it opened my eyes to why Trump is so destructive, because he's all about fear. It's all about fear.
Mhm.
And even that was even the name of Bob Woodward's book about him. His Bob Woodward's book about Trump is called Fear, right? And I realized this was so the sermon is 90, the sermon's about 27 minutes long, and 6 minutes is about Trump. The other 21 minutes is about this idea that America is drawn between hope and fear, right? And I argued that the hope part of America is really based on our scripture. Benjamin Franklin wanted the crossing of the Red Sea to be the national emblem because the American founding fathers, the founding mothers, the American founders found hope in our story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is one of the reasons why we Jews feel so comfortable here, because really the American story is our story. It's a story of the abiding capacity of human beings to hope. If slaves can be free, then hope is alive. Then there's a God in history moving us toward freedom. That's the Jewish part of the sermon, right? So the second thing was that was the idiom that I chose. And then I made a very conscious choice, except for that one part about choosing the American narrative of hope. I decided not to make this a Torah sermon because I didn't want people to hear the Torah says Trump is bad, because I don't think that's true. I think the Torah teaches us values, and insofar as the Trump and his administration, oppose those values, then one can say this is not Torah appropriate. It's not congruent with our values. But I didn't want to say God doesn't want Trump to be president. I didn't want people to hear that. So I kept the Torah part of the sermon very small, and made this an American speech. All right. And before I gave it, by the way, I sent it to a dozen friends, including 3 friends of mine who were on the Republican National Committee. And they all wrote back to me and said, it's great. It's what needs to be said. And I said it, and I got a lot of flack for it. And I don't give political sermons. I haven't given a real political sermon since. And that was 6 years ago. I don't know what we'll do now. But I really felt at that point that I needed to say this. I needed to say to my community that it's not his policies I object to. This is not about whether we should build a wall or not build a wall. It's not about whether we should be closer to the Russians or farther from the Russians. It's not about taxation. It's not about any of the specific policies of the Trump administration. It's about his character and the leadership and the character he projects into the country. I made the case, Mitchum makes the case, that the American presidency is this unique office because the character of the president then is projected into the country. And I argued that this man's character is profoundly broken, and he's bringing that brokenness to bear on America, and we're all beginning to suffer for it. That was the argument. And I would stand by that argument today. I think subsequent events, that was 2 years before January, or 3 years before January 6th, right? I would stand by that thesis today. I would give the sermon again today if I had to, because I'm way, way, way more afraid that my grandchildren will come to me one day and say, what did you say? Or why didn't you say something? Than the people in my shul who are going to leave because they want a more conservative rabbi.
Yeah. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. Maybe talk about some of the obstacles facing rabbis today, giving sermons in terms of attention spans, distractions, the phones, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I'm going to go back to my basics, if it's okay with you. If you have something to say, if you have a deep truth, if you have a Torah, if you have a truth that you believe is so important for these people to hear, a truth about how they ought to live, a truth about how we should see our world, a truth about the Jewish people and its fate in the world. If you have that truth burning inside of you, you'll manage everything else. That's where this needs to start and end. Okay? Then there's a certain technique about how to put a sermon together. You got to use an idiom that people understand. You have to use language that people understand. You're welcome to use humor. I use a lot of humor in my sermons because humor opens people up. I tell a lot of stories because stories opens people's hearts up so they can hear a truth. But it all begins and ends in having a message that matters. And that's what's most important. And having a message that matters means you're always learning. You're reading widely. You're talking to people all over the place. I always told my students that the greatest skill of a rabbi is not speaking. The greatest skill of a rabbi is listening. Can you listen to people? Can you hear what they're concerned about? Can you hear what they're saying to you? Can you hear what they're not saying to you? Can you hear what they're not saying to you? Can you hear what they're holding back because they don't want to hurt the rabbi's feelings? Or they know that, when you go to a funeral where there's a catastrophe, people don't often come right up to you and say, why did God let this happen? But they're all thinking it. And they all want to know, where is your theology? You have all these books in your office, Rabbi. Doesn't one of them have an answer to this question? Right? You give all these sermons. Can't you help me find a pathway from brokenness back to wholeness? That you have to listen for the questions they're not asking. And you have to speak to those questions and be bold and strong and speak to those questions. Very, very few rabbis get fired because of what they said and they believe in. Most rabbis get fired because they preach things they don't believe in, because their inauthenticity or their superficiality or their lack of learning is so obvious to a congregation. That's why they stop listening to us. That's why they stop listening to us. Look, what's the greatest moment? The greatest moment is when you're giving a talk and you see people put their phones down and start listening to you. That's when you know you got them, right? You're more interesting than their Facebook feed, right? You can't get them to stop listening to their phones, but if you can say something that's so important and so profound and so interesting and so engaging that it matters, they'll listen. Or they'll turn to you and say, what did you just say? Right? What did you just say? Did you record that? When they ask me, is this being recorded? I love that. Is this being recorded means I wasn't listening when you said it the first time. I want to go home and hear it this time. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I mean, so look, there have always been distractions. There have always been, people have always put up, shields and obstacles in the way of the truth that we teach. But rabbis have always found a way to sort of penetrate those shields, using emotional vulnerability, using stories, using humor, but most of all, by talking to things that matter to you.
Amazing. Wow, you nailed it.
No, I mean, that's what it is. That's what it is.
This was such an enjoyable hour. I appreciate it. And
thank you. You take care. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you should happen to come across Hillel Skolnick, who I think is in your community.
Yeah, I met him.
All right, run up to him and give him a hug and tell him Eddie says hello. I was his father's chavrusa in rabbinical school.
Oh, wow.
And I was at Hillel's bris and I was at Hillel's bar mitzvah. And so I'm honored that he's out there in the community.
Yeah.
And any of the people from Wexner, Elka,
Sure.
and all those people, Misha, the good people from Wexner, are just such lovely, lovely people.
Yeah.
Moses, what's his name? He's wonderful. These are just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. So
yeah. I've met all of them while I've been here.
They're wonderful, wonderful people. I've worked with them, and for them, I work with them, and they're visionary people who really care about the future of the Jewish people. Well, thank you for listening so long. You've been very kind.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't tear away. You spoke your truth and you got me in.
All right. You take care.
I have two quick questions. One
Sure,
is,
of course, yeah. Sorry.
what do you, is there any projects or anything specific you want me to direct people towards, or any links to your books or anything like that?
All my books are on Amazon. My first book was an accident. I was writing a thing for our bar mitzvah kids, and a friend of mine said, publish it. So it's called Tough Questions Jews Ask. It's Judaism for 13-year-olds. And it's the scenario is a class of 7th graders that chase away every teacher they put in front of them. So the rabbi takes over the class, and the kid said, well, as long as you're here, we have a few questions.
Wow.
So I've been doing that with my kids for years now, to answering kids' Shelot and Shuvot. So Tough Questions Jews Ask, it's on Amazon. Capturing the Moon is the storybook. There's a book of philosophy, which is really, it's the philosophy I learned from my teachers, from Yitz Greenberg and David Hartman and Harold Schulweis, called Chutzpah, the Chutzpah Imperative. And then my biography of Rabbi Schulweis is called Godliness, or The Quest for Godliness. So any of those books, they're all on Amazon. And right now, I have a grandson coming any minute now. So
I'm so excited.
I need the day school tuition. So send the check directly to the Valley Beth Shalom Day School.
As they say, B'Shah Tovah. Yeah.
And you stay well. Thank you for inviting me.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. Learn more about the Maggid Method at maggid, maggid.com, maggidmethod.com. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.